footsteps came again in the dead of night, soft, deliberate, circling his cell like a predator stalking prey. Don Carlos jerked awake, his breath ragged, the thin straw mattress beneath him damp with sweat. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint glow of a distant torch flickering under the iron-barred door. He strained his ears, heart pounding against his ribs. The sound faded, leaving only the echo of his own ragged breathing. Phantoms, he told himself. Or worse, his father's spies. The cold seeped through the stone walls, biting into his flesh. He pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders, but it did little to ward off the chill. His fingers brushed the rough, uneven surface of the wall beside him, tracing the grooves where he had clawed at the mortar in fits of desperation. A metallic taste lingered on his tongue, left over from the meager meal they had shoved through the slot in the door hours ago. Gruel, if it could even be called that, laced with the faint tang of rusted iron. He had eaten it without complaint, though his stomach twisted in protest. Hunger was a constant companion now, gnawing at him like a rat at a corpse. His mind wandered, as it often did, to the life he had lost, the grand halls of the Alcazar, the weight of a crown that had never truly been his. His father's face loomed in his memory, cold, calculating, those piercing eyes, seeing only a threat where a son should have been. "You are no heir of mine." The words still burned, sharper than the chains around his wrists. A sudden clang of metal made him flinch. The door's viewing slit snapped open, and for a fleeting moment, a pair of eyes glinted in the torchlight, watching, judging. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Don Carlos exhaled, his breath a ghostly mist in the frigid air. The footsteps would return. They always did. And in the silence that followed, he wondered if they were real at all, or if the darkness had finally begun to whisper back. The halls of the Alcazar had once been alive with laughter. His laughter. Don Carlos remembered it now, as the cold of his cell gnawed at his bones. He had been young then, reckless, the golden heir to an empire that stretched across the world. But even in those days, shadows had clung to him. His tutors had whispered of his temper, how his moods could shift like a storm at sea. One moment he would be charming, his wit sharp enough to draw reluctant smiles from even the sternest courtiers. The next, his fists would fly, his voice a roar that sent servants scattering. "The prince is not well," they murmured behind their hands. King Philip II heard those whispers. He heard everything. Carlos could still see his father's face pale and impassive as marble, those dark eyes missing nothing. The king had never embraced him, not truly. Even as a child, Carlos had felt the weight of that distance, the unspoken question hanging between them. Would this boy be his ruin? The first time his father had struck him, Carlos had been 12. A petty argument over a missed lesson, a snapped insult about his mother's memory. The king's hand had moved faster than thought, the crack of his palm against Carlos's cheek echoing through the chamber. "You will learn respect," Philip had hissed. Carlos had learned many things, but respect was not one of them. By 16, his rages were legend. He threw a servant down a flight of stairs for spilling wine on his doublet. He shattered a priceless Venetian mirror because his reflection mocked him. The court held its breath whenever he passed, waiting for the next explosion. And his father watched, always watched. "He is unstable," Philip confided to his advisers, the words slipping like poison into the ears of men who knew better than to disagree. A danger to himself, to Spain. Carlos had known they spoke of him. He'd seen the way his father's gaze lingered on him during council meetings, as if measuring the space between his shoulders for a blade. Then came the night that sealed his fate. Drunk on stolen wine, Carlos had stormed into the royal chapel, shouting oaths that turned the priests pale. He'd raged against his father's rule, against the suffocating grip of duty, against the God who had cursed him with a crown he could never wear. The king found him there, kneeling before the altar like a sinner begging forgiveness, or a rebel plotting treason. Their eyes met in the candlelight. No words were spoken, none were needed. The shadows in Philip's gaze had deepened that night, and Carlos, for the first time, understood true fear. His father did not see a son. He saw a threat. The arrest came without warning. Don Carlos had been pacing his chambers, the weight of sleepless nights pressing down on him like a second skin. The air smelled of candle wax and damp stone, the silence broken only by the distant tolling of the monastery bell. Then boots, dozens of them, marching in grim unison down the corridor. He turned just as the door burst open. Royal guards flooded the room, their breastplates gleaming in the torchlight. At their head stood the Duke of Alba, his face an unreadable mask. By order of His Majesty King Philip II, the Duke intoned, voice devoid of inflection, "You are to be placed under arrest." Carlos laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. On what charge? Treason. The word struck like a blade. He lunged, not at the guards but toward the desk where his dagger lay. A futile gesture. Hands seized him iron strong, wrenching his arms behind his back. He thrashed, snarling curses, but they forced him to his knees. "You can't do this," he spat. "I am your prince." The Duke of Alba's expression did not change, not any more. They dragged him through the palace like a common criminal. Courtiers pressed themselves against the walls, eyes wide with shock and worse relief. Whispers slithered in his wake. They say he plotted with the Dutch rebels. Heard he tried to poison the king. Madness runs in his blood. Lies, all of them. The last face he saw before the dungeon swallowed him was his father's. Philip stood at the top of the staircase, motionless as a statue, watching his son's descent into darkness. Their eyes met, one last, silent exchange. No anger, no regret, only the cold calculation of a king erasing a mistake. The cell door slammed shut, the key turned. And just like that, Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish Empire, ceased to exist. Alone in the blackness, he pressed his forehead to the freezing stone floor. The whispers of treason still coiled in his ears, but louder still was the echo of his father's unspoken verdict. You were never meant to wear the crown. Time had no meaning in the dark. Don Carlos no longer knew if it had been days or months since his father's guards had thrown him into this tomb of stone. The air was thick with a stench of mildew and his own unwashed body, a rancid perfume that clung to his skin like a second layer of filth. His once fine clothes had rotted into rags, the embroidery now indistinguishable from the frayed threads. He pressed a trembling hand against the wall, fingers tracing the grooves where he had scratched at the mortar, in a futile attempt to mark the passage of time. His nails were broken, bloody from the effort. The walls gave nothing back. No sunlight ever reached him. The only light came from the flickering torch outside his cell, its glow seeping beneath the door in thin, wavering lines. He had learned to hate that light, its teasing promise of a world beyond these four walls, a world he would never see again. His body was failing. The fever came and went in waves, leaving him shivering one moment and drenched in sweat the next. His joints ached, his stomach a hollow pit that gnawed at itself in hunger. The guards brought food when they remembered, hard bread, rancid meat, water that tasted of rust. He devoured it all, choking down the rot, knowing it was the only thing keeping death at bay. But death was patient. At night, or what he imagined was night, the rats came. He heard them first, their tiny claws skittering across the stone, their squeaks like laughter in the dark. Then they grew bold, creeping closer, their beady eyes glinting in the dim light. He had tried to kill them once, lunging with a desperate fury, but they were too fast. Now he lay still, watching as they feasted on the crumbs he had no strength to reach. Perhaps they'll feast on me next. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it made him laugh, a hoarse, broken sound that echoed back at him like a mockery. His mind was unraveling. He dreamed of open skies, of galloping horses, of the throne that should have been his, but when he woke gasping, the walls were always there, pressing in, closer each time. Sometimes he saw faces in the shadows, his father's cold stare, his mother's ghostly smile, the blurred features of a woman he might have loved in another life. They whispered to him, voices overlapping, until he couldn't tell memory from madness. One day or night he clawed at the walls until his fingers bled, screaming for release, for light, for anything but this endless dark. The guards ignored him. They always did. Exhausted, he slumped to the floor, his breath ragged. The stone was cold against his cheek. Somewhere beyond these walls, Spain thrived. His father ruled. The world moved on. And here, in the cell's embrace, Don Carlos was already forgotten. The guards spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one could hear. He screams like a demon, one muttered, shifting his weight from foot to foot outside the prince's cell. The torchlight flickered across his face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. Last night, it went on for hours, begging for mercy, for death. I couldn't tell which. His companion, an older man with a grizzled beard, grunted and crossed himself. Cursed, if you ask me. No man howls like that unless something's gnawing at his soul. They fell silent as a servant girl approached, her arms laden with a tray of stale bread and a pitcher of water. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the heavy oak door that sealed Don Carlos away. "Is it true?" she whispered, voice trembling. "What they say about him?" The older guard scowled. "Best not to ask, girl. Some things aren't meant to be known." But the rumors had already taken root, slithering through the palace like a sickness. In the kitchens, cooks exchanged glances as they kneaded dough. "They say he tears at his own skin," one murmured, wiping flour-streaked hands on her apron. "Claims the walls are breathing." In the stables, grooms shivered despite the summer heat. "Heard he talks to ghosts," a stable boy confided, stroking a nervous horse's flank. "Names them, his mother, his tutors, even the king, like they're standing right there in the dark with him." Even the courtiers, who had once bowed and scraped in Don Carlos's presence, now spoke his name with a mix of pity and revulsion. "Madness runs in the blood," a duchess sniffed, fanning herself as if to ward off the very thought. "His grandfather, they say, saw devils in his final days." "A mercy, then," another noble murmured, "that the king locked him away before he could taint the throne." But not all whispers were so dismissive. In the quiet corners of the palace, where the walls were thin and loyalties thinner, some dared to wonder aloud, what if he isn't mad? What if he's right? A young scribe, tasked with recording the prince's dwindling rations, hesitated outside the cell one evening. The screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie, rhythmic scraping like nails on stone. Against his better judgment, he pressed his ear to the door. Not real. None of it. The prince's voice rasped from within, raw and broken. The crown was glass. The throne was ash. He knew. He always knew. The scribe recoiled, but as he hurried away, he couldn't shake the thought. What if the prince wasn't raving? What if he was the only one who saw the truth? By dawn, even that whisper had faded, buried beneath the weight of the king's silence, the guard's superstitions, and the relentless march of time. And in his cell, Don Carlos laughed low and broken at the joke only he understood. The world called him mad, but madness, he knew, was the only sane response to a world like this. The physician arrived at dusk, summoned by a rare decree from the king himself. Dr. Mendoza was a gaunt man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually furrowed brow. He had treated nobles and peasants alike, but never a prisoner like this, never a prince-turned-ghost. The guards led him through the winding corridors of the dungeon, their torchlight carving grotesque shadows from the damp walls. "You are to examine him," the captain of the guard muttered, his voice low. "Not treat him, His Majesty's orders." Mendoza nodded, though the distinction sat uneasily in his gut. The cell door groaned open, and the stench hit him first, a miasma of sweat, infection, and rot. Then came the sight. Don Carlos, curled like a wounded animal in the far corner, his once proud frame reduced to a skeletal husk. The prince's matted hair clung to his sunken cheeks, his lips cracked and bleeding. His eyes, when they flickered open, were glassy with fever. "Another phantom," the prince rasped, his voice a ruin of what it must have once been. "Or have you come to bleed me dry, leech?" Mendoza knelt beside him, setting down his leather satchel with deliberate care. He did not flinch when the prince recoiled, nor when a bony hand lashed out in feeble defiance. "I am here to help, Your Highness," he lied. The examination was swift, clinical. The physician's hands moved with practiced precision, peeling back the prince's tattered shirt to reveal the festering wounds beneath ulcers, where the chains had bitten into his wrists, the angry red streaks of infection spider-webbing up his arms. His ribs jutted like the bars of a cage, his breath shallow and rattling. "He needs treatment," Mendoza said sharply, turning to the guards. "Clean bandages, a poultice for the fever, decent food, or he won't last the month." The captain's expression didn't change. "Our orders stand. Examine, report, do nothing more." Mendoza's jaw tightened. "This is not examination. It is witnessing a murder." A dry chuckle bubbled from Don Carlos's throat. "Tell my father," he wheezed, "that his physician has a poet's tongue. Will he hang you for it, I wonder?" The guards shifted uncomfortably. One made the sign of the cross. Mendoza hesitated, then reached into his satchel. Not for medicine. There would be no defying the king's command, but for a small vial of lavender oil. He uncorked it, letting the scent cut through the cell's fetid air, and dabbed a drop onto the prince's pulse point. A meaningless gesture, a fleeting kindness. Don Carlos inhaled sharply, his fever-bright eyes locking onto the physician's. For a moment something like clarity flickered in their depths. She wore lavender, he whispered. My mother, did you know that? Mendoza did not answer. He could not. The captain cleared his throat. Time's up. As the physician rose, Don Carlos's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Tell me, he hissed. Do I seem mad to you? Mendoza met his gaze. The truth coiled in his throat, bitter as poison. No, Your Highness, he murmured. You seem like a man who remembers too much. The prince's grip slackened. His laughter followed Mendoza out of the cell, echoing down the corridor even after the door slammed shut. Back in the torchlit hallway, the captain eyed the physician with suspicion. You'll report to His Majesty that the prince is unwell, as expected. Nothing more. Mendoza nodded mechanically, already rehearsing the lies he would tell. But in the silence of his own heart, another truth took root. Some sicknesses could not be cured, and some were not of the body, but of the crown itself. Hunger was a blade, carving him hollow. Don Carlos lay curled on the stone floor, his stomach clenched in a knot so tight he could hardly breathe. The guards had not brought food in days, or had they? Time had dissolved into a blur of thirst and delirium. He licked his cracked lips, tasting blood where they had split. The last meal they'd shoved through the slot had been rancid, crawling with maggots, but he'd devoured it anyway, gagging as the spoiled meat slid down his throat. Now even that was gone, leaving only the gnawing void inside him. A rustling sound made him lift his head. Rats. They emerged from the shadows like tiny skulking thieves, their whiskers twitching, their eyes glinting in the faint light. He had grown accustomed to their presence, to their boldness as they scavenged the crumbs he was too weak to reach. But now, as he watched them scurry across the floor, a new thought took root, one that made his pulse quicken. Food. The first time the idea came to him, he recoiled. He was a prince, heir to the Spanish throne. The thought of sinking his teeth into vermin was unthinkable, but hunger had a way of stripping away pride, of reducing a man to his basest instincts. His fingers twitched. One of the rats, bolder than the rest, crept closer, sniffing at the frayed edge of his sleeve. Don Carlos held his breath. Then, with a speed that surprised even him, he lunged. His hand closed around warm fur. The creature squealed, writhing in his grip, its claws raking his skin. He gritted his teeth, tightened his hold, and snapped its neck. The sound was small, final. For a long moment he stared at the limp body in his hand, his stomach churning with revulsion. Then the hunger roared back, louder than shame. He did not hesitate again. The first bite was the hardest. The flesh was tough, the taste metallic and gamey, but his body didn't care. It screamed for sustenance, and he obeyed, tearing into the rat like a starving dog. Blood smeared his chin, his fingers, he barely noticed. By the third bite he was weeping. The rats, sensing danger, had fled, all but one, a smaller one, lingering near the wall, frozen in fear. Don Carlos wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and lunged again. This time, he didn't kill it first. The creature's shrieks filled the cell as his teeth sank into its belly. Hot blood flooded his mouth and he gagged, but forced himself to swallow. The rat thrashed, its tiny heart pounding against his tongue, until finally, mercifully, it went still. He ate until there was nothing left but bones. Then he collapsed onto his side, his body trembling, his mind adrift. What have I become? The answer came in his father's voice, cold and mocking. Exactly what I always knew you were. Laughter bubbled up in his throat, raw and broken. He let it spill out, echoing off the walls, until it turned into something else, a sob, a scream, a prayer. Outside, the guards shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. He's finally lost it, one muttered. But Don Carlos wasn't listening. He was already dreaming of the next rat. The servant girl Anna had no business lingering near the prince's cell. She knew the risks. The king's wrath was legendary, and curiosity was a luxury servants could ill afford. Yet, night after night, she found herself drawn to the heavy oak door, her ears straining for the sounds within. Tonight, the prince was quiet. Anna pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her fingers twisting in the rough fabric of her apron. The torchlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced like spectres down the corridor. The guards had grown lax in their vigil. Why bother watching a man already dead in all but name? A muffled groan seeped through the door. Anna's breath hitched. She shouldn't be here. If the captain caught her, he'd have her whipped or worse. But the prince's voice, raw and broken, tugged at something in her chest. Water. The plea was so faint she almost missed it. Her eyes darted to the bucket by her feet, filled with scraps from the kitchen, stale bread, a wedge of cheese, a water skin she'd stolen when the cook wasn't looking. It wasn't much, but it was more than the prince had seen in weeks. Her hand hovered over the door's feeding slot. Do it. Don't. Loyalty warred with pity. The king had ordered the prince starved, his spirit broken before his body followed. To disobey was treason. But Anna remembered the boy the prince had once been. Reckless, yes, but with a smile that could light up a room. She'd seen him toss coins to beggars, laugh with stable boys, sneak sweets to the kitchen children when he thought no one was looking. That boy was gone, erased by the king's command. Did he deserve to die like this? Her fingers trembled as she lifted the slot's cover. The stench of the cell rolled out. Sour sweat, infection, the metallic tang of old blood. She gagged but forced herself to peer inside. The prince lay curled on the floor, his back to her. His ribs jutted like knife blades beneath his skin, his hair a matted nest. Chains glinted at his wrists, the flesh around them swollen and red. Anna's throat tightened. She shoved the water skin through the slot. It hit the ground with a soft thud. The prince didn't move. For a terrible moment she feared he was already dead. Then slowly his head turned, his eyes sunken, fever-bright, fixed on the offering. He lurched forward, chains clanking, and seized the water skin with shaking hands. He drank greedily, water sloshing down his chin, his chest. When he finished, he stared at the empty skin as if it were a miracle. Then his gaze lifted to the slot. Anna froze. Their eyes met through the narrow opening. She saw no recognition in his face, only a feral, desperate hope. More, he croaked. Her heart hammered. She shoved the bread and cheese through, then snatched her hand back as if burned. The prince fell upon the food like a wild thing, his teeth tearing into the loaf with a violence that made her flinch. A boot scuffed stone behind her. Anna whirled. The captain of the guard stood at the corridor's end, his expression unreadable. Her blood turned to ice. He knew. She dropped into a curtsy, her mind racing for excuses, but the captain merely turned away, his footsteps echoing into silence. Anna exhaled, her knees weak with relief. But as she fled the dungeon, the prince's voice followed her, a whisper in the dark. Thank you. The words haunted her all the way back to the kitchens. She wouldn't return. She couldn't. Yet even as she vowed it, she knew she'd be back tomorrow. The fever had him now. Don Carlos lay on the cold stone, his body a map of pain, each breath a struggle, each heartbeat a sluggish protest against the inevitable. The cell swam around him, the walls breathing in and out like the ribs of some great beast. He could no longer tell if his eyes were open or closed. The darkness had become a living thing, whispering in his ears, curling around his limbs like a lover's embrace. Mother. She stood in the corner of the cell, bathed in a light that shouldn't exist. Maria Manuela of Portugal, her face as he remembered it from the portraits, soft, kind, the ghost of a smile on her lips. She held out a hand, her fingers pale as moonlight. You were always too much like me, she murmured. Too much fire for this cold court. Carlos reached for her, but his chains held him fast. The iron bit into his wrists, drawing fresh blood. Take me with you, he begged. Her smile faltered. Not yet, my love. Then she was gone, and the cell was empty again. He gasped, the vision dissolving like smoke. The fever painted new pictures across the dark. A throne room, vast and echoing, the crown of Spain resting on a velvet cushion. His father's voice boomed from the shadows. You were never worthy of it. Carlos laughed, or tried to. The sound came out as a wheeze, his lungs burning. I know, he whispered. The crown shimmered, then melted into a pool of gold at his feet. Another face flickered into view, Isabella. His betrothed, his almost bride, her dark eyes wide with sorrow. She had been a girl when they promised her to him, a pawn in his father's games. He'd barely known her, yet here she was, kneeling beside him, her cool fingers brushing his forehead. You could have been happy, she said. No, he rasped, not in this world. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. Then close your eyes, my prince. The next one will be kinder. A door creaked open, real this time. Footsteps approached. Carlos turned his head, expecting the guards, the physician, death itself. But it was his father who stood over him. King Philip II, resplendent in black velvet, his face unreadable. The torchlight gilded the lines of his jaw, the silver in his beard. He looked every inch the king. Carlos' breath hitched. "Come to watch me die?" Philip did not answer. His gaze swept over his son's ruined body, the hollows of his cheeks, the festering wounds. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret? Relief? "You should have been stronger," the king said at last. Carlos coughed, blood flecking his lips. "And you should have been a father." The words hung between them, sharp as a blade. Philip turned away. "Wait." Carlos's voice was a raw scrape of sound. "Tell me, was it ever real? Any of it?" The king paused at the door. For a heartbeat, Carlos thought he might speak. Then the door closed, and the darkness swallowed everything. Alone again, Don Carlos let his head fall back against the stone. The visions returned, his mother's hand, Isabella's smile, the crown he would never wear. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he was not afraid. The cold seeped deeper, slowing his pulse, his thoughts. Don Carlos no longer felt the chains. His body was weightless, adrift in the dark. The fever's fire had burned down to embers, leaving only a quiet, creeping numbness. He exhaled, watching his breath mist in the air, one more ghost to join the others. Somewhere beyond the cell, a bell tolled. Midnight, perhaps, or his funeral knell. Let it ring. He had fought for so long against the walls, the hunger, the silence. Now there was nothing left to fight. His father had won. Spain would never know his name. History would remember him as a traitor, a madman, a cautionary tale whispered in royal courts. A fitting end for a prince who never was. A rustle of fabric made him stir. The servant girl Anna knelt beside him once more, her face pale in the dim light. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, her hands trembling. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "Neither should you," she whispered back. He wanted to laugh. Instead, he coughed, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. Anna wiped the blood from his lips with the edge of her sleeve. "Tell me," he rasped, "do they still speak of me, up there?" She hesitated. "Yes." "Lies, then." "Some." Her voice wavered, "but not all. I remember." A spark of warmth flickered in his chest. "What do you remember?" "The oranges," she said softly. "You stole a basket from the kitchens once, tossed them to the children in the courtyard, laughed when the Duchess scolded you." He had forgotten that. The memory surfaced like a long-lost coin, bright, fleeting. They were sour, he recalled. The children made such faces. Anna smiled, just barely. "They loved you for it." The bell tolled again. Don Carlos's eyelids grew heavy. The dark pressed in, but it no longer frightened him. Anna's hand found his, her fingers small and warm against his wasted skin. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Until the end," she promised. He closed his eyes. The last breath left his lungs like a sigh, soft, unburdened. And in the silence that followed, Anna wept. Beyond the cell, Spain slept. The king did not stir. The world turned, unseeing, uncaring. But in the dark, where no one would ever think to look, a single candle flickered to life. And a prince at last was free.